Good evening, everybody. Welcome to What Can I Do podcast, Education Vision. And we're doing a course on rights, equality, and inequality, justice and injustice. And this is the third in our series of essays and other works. This particular one is the statement by Nelson Mandela from the dock at the opening of the defense case in the Rivonia trial, Pretoria Supreme Court. And I'm going to do some expert excerpts because it's substantially long and some of it has to do with ideas and some of it has to do with history. So I picked out enough so that we can have something to talk about. So Mandela says, I've already mentioned that I was one of the persons who helped to form Umkhonto. I and the others who started the organization did so for two reasons. Firstly, we believed that as a result of government policy, violence by the African people had become inevitable, and that unless responsible leadership was given to canalize and control the feelings of our people, there would be outbreaks of terrorism, which would produce an intensity of bitterness and hostility between the various races of this country, which is not produced even by war. Secondly, we felt that without violence, there would be no way open to the African people to succeed in their struggle against the principle of white supremacy. All lawful modes of expressing opposition to this principle had been closed by legislation. And we were placed in a position in which we had either to accept a permanent state of inferiority or to defy the government. We chose to defy the law. We first broke the law in a way which avoided any recourse to violence. When this form was legislated against, and then the government resorted to a show of force to crush opposition to its policies, only then did we decide to answer violence with violence. Essentially, we had a choice. We could decide we're second class and live that way forever, or we could stand up for ourselves at some point. But the violence which we chose to adopt was not terrorism. We who formed Umkhonto were all members of the African National Congress and had behind us the ANC tradition of nonviolence and negotiation as a means of solving political disputes. We believed that South Africa belongs to all the people who live in it, not to one group, be it black or white. We did not want an interracial war and tried to avoid it to the last minute. If the court is in doubt about this, it will be seen that the whole history of our organization bears out what I have said, and that I will subsequently say when I describe the tactics which Umkhonto decided to adopt. I want, therefore, to say something about the African National Congress. The African National Congress was formed in 1912 to defend the rights of the African people, which had been seriously curtailed by the South Africa Act, and which were then being threatened by the Native Land Act. For 37 years, that is, until 1949, it adhered strictly to a constitutional struggle. It put forth demands and resolutions. It sent delegations to the government in the belief that African grievances could be settled through peaceful discussion and that Africans could advance gradually to full political rights. But white governments remained unmoved, and the rights of Africans became less instead of becoming greater. In the words of my leader, Chief Lutuli, who became president of the ANC in 1952 and who was later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Who will deny that 30 years of my life have been spent knocking in vain, patiently, moderately, and modestly at a closed and barred door? What have been the fruits of moderation? The past 30 years have seen the greatest number of laws restricting our rights and progress. Until today, we've reached a stage where we have almost no rights at all. This is the issue that people more to the left are having with moderates today. Even after 1949, the ANC remained determined to avoid violence. At this time, however, there was a change from the strictly constitutional means of protest which had been employed in the past. The change was embodied in a decision which was taken to protest against apartheid legislation by peaceful but unlawful demonstrations against certain laws. Pursuant to this policy, the ANC launched the Defiance Campaign, in which I was placed in charge of volunteers. This campaign was based on the principles of passive resistance. More than 8,500 people defied apartheid laws and went to jail. Yet there was not a single instance of violence in the course of this campaign on the part of any defier. I and 19 colleagues were convicted for the role which we played in organizing the campaign, but our sentences were suspended, mainly because the judge found that discipline and nonviolence had been stressed throughout. This was the time when the volunteer section of the ANC was established and when the word Amadela Kufa was first used. This was the time when volunteers were asked to take a pledge to uphold certain principles. Evidence dealing with volunteers and their pledges has been introduced into this case, but completely out of context. The volunteers were not and are not the soldiers of a black army pledged to fight a civil war against the whites. They were and are dedicated workers who are prepared to lead campaigns initiated by the ANC to distribute leaflets, to organize strikes, or do whatever the particular campaign required. They are called volunteers because they volunteer to face the penalties of imprisonment and whipping, which are now prescribed by the legislature for such acts. You know you're losing when you try to whip people. During the Defiance campaign, the Public Safety Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed. I'm going to do that again. During the Defiance campaign, the Public Safety Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed. These statutes provided harsher penalties for offenses committed by way of protests against laws. Despite this, the protests continued and the ANC adhered to its policy of nonviolence. In 1956, 156 leading members of the Congress Alliance, including myself, were arrested on a charge of high treason and charges under the Suppression of Communism Act. The nonviolent policy of the ANC was put in issue by the state, but when the court gave judgment some 5 years later, it found that the ANC did not have a policy of violence. We were acquitted on all counts, which included a count that the ANC sought to set up a communist state in place of the existing regime. The government has always sought to label all its opponents as communists. This sounds familiar. This allegation has been repeated in the present case, but as I will show, the ANC is not and never has been a communist organization. In 1960, there was the shooting at Sharpeville, which resulted in the proclamation of a state of emergency and the declaration of the ANC as an unlawful organization. My colleagues and I, after careful consideration, decided we would not obey this decree. The African people were not part of the government and did not make the laws by which they were governed. We believed in the words of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that the will of the people shall be the basis of authority of government. And for us to accept the banning was equivalent to accepting the silence of the Africans for all times. Bear in mind, this is on their own land. The ANC refused to dissolve, but instead went underground. We believed it was our duty to preserve this organization, which had been built up with almost 50 years of unremitting toil. I have no doubt that no self-respecting white political organization would disband itself if declared illegal by a government in which it had no say. I put the emphasis in the wrong place. Let me read that sentence again. I have no doubt that no self-respecting white political organization would disband itself if declared illegal by a government in which it had no say. In 1960, the government held a referendum which led to the establishment of the Republic Afrikaans, who constituted approximately 70% of the population of South Africa. Oh, no, I'm wrong. Cut. In 1960, the government held a referendum which led to the establishment of the Republic. There's a period there. In 1960, the government held a referendum which led to the establishment of the Republic. Africans, who constitute approximately 70% of the population of South Africa, were not entitled to vote and were not even consulted about the proposed constitutional change. All of us were apprehensive of our future under the proposed White Republic, and a resolution was taken to hold an all-in-African conference to call for a national convention and to organize mass demonstrations on the eve of the unwanted republic. If the government failed to call the convention, I'm going to go back and I'm going to start that paragraph over, cut and cut. In 1960, the government held a referendum which led to the establishment of the Republic. Africans, who constituted approximately 70% of the population of South Africa, were not entitled to vote and were not even consulted about the proposed constitutional change. All of us were apprehensive of our future under the proposed White Republic, and a resolution was taken to hold an all-in African conference to call for a national convention and to organize mass demonstrations on the eve of the unwanted republic if the government failed to call the convention. The conference was attended by Africans of various political persuasions. I was the secretary of the conference and undertook to be responsible for organizing the national stay-at-home, which was subsequently called to coincide with the Declaration of the Republic. As all strikes by Africans are illegal, the person organizing such a strike must avoid arrest. I was chosen to be this person, and consequently I had to leave my home and family and my practice and go into hiding to avoid arrest. The stay-at-home, in accordance with the ANC policy, was to be a peaceful demonstration. Careful instructions were given to organizers and members to avoid any recourse to violence. The government's answer was to introduce new and harsher laws, to mobilize its armed forces, and to send Saracens, armed vehicles, and soldiers into the townships in a massive show of force to intimidate the people. This was an indication that the government had decided to rule. Click in the wrong place, and that's what happens. To rule by force alone, and this decision was a milestone on the road to Umkhonto. And before I read the next selection, I wanted to look up the armed vehicles. Just not sure of pronunciation. I'm glad I looked. It's a
Saracens.
Saracens is a historical term used by Greeks, Romans, and later European Christians to describe Arab tribes and subsequently all Muslims. A broad, often derogatory term for Islamic forces. All right. So that was his justification, despite having nonviolent values and beliefs and even agreements. I mean, it comes down to this. How long do we wait for basic human dignity? And when do we stand up and take it? We had no doubt that we had to continue the fight. Anything else would have been abject surrender. Our problem was not whether to fight, but was how to continue the fight. We of the ANC had always stood for a non-racial democracy, and we shrank from any action which might drive the races further apart than they already were. But the hard facts were that 50 years of nonviolence had brought the African people nothing but more and more repressive legislation and fewer rights. It may not be easy for this court to understand, but it is a fact that for a long time the people had been talking of violence, of the day when they would fight the white man and win back their country. And we, the leaders of the ANC, had nevertheless always prevailed upon them to avoid violence and to pursue peaceful methods. When some of us discussed this in May and June of 1961, it could not be denied that our policy to achieve a non-racial state by nonviolence had achieved nothing. And that our followers were beginning to lose confidence in this policy and were developing disturbing ideas of terrorism. It must not be forgotten that by this time violence had, in fact, become a feature of the South African political scene. There had been violence in 1957 when the women of Zurust were ordered to carry passes. There was violence in 1958 with the enforcement of cattle culling in Sekhukhune. And there was violence in 1959 when the people of Kato Manor protested against pass raids. There was violence in 1960 when the government attempted to impose Bantu authorities in Pondoland. 39 Africans died in these disturbances. In 1961, there'd been riots and warm baths, and all this time the Transkei had been a seething mass of unrest. Each disturbance pointed clearly to the inevitable growth among Africans of the belief that violence was the only way out. It showed that a government which uses force to maintain its rule teaches the oppressed to use force to oppose it. Let me say that again. It showed that a government which uses force to maintain its rule teaches the oppressed to use force to oppose it. What do we teach children by spanking them? that violence is okay sometimes. Already, small groups had arisen in the urban areas were spontaneously making plans for violent forms of political struggle. There now arose a danger that these groups would adopt terrorism against Africans as well as whites if not properly directed. Particularly disturbing was the type of violence engendered in places such as Zirust, Kuniland, and Pondoland amongst Africans. It was increasingly taking the form not of struggle against the government, though this was what prompted it, but of civil strife among themselves conducted in such a way that it could not hope to achieve anything other than a loss of life and bitterness. At the beginning of June 1961, after a long and anxious assessment of the South African situation, I and some colleagues came to the conclusion that as violence in this country was inevitable, it would be unrealistic and wrong for African leaders to continue preaching peace and nonviolence at a time when the government met our peaceful demands with force. This conclusion was not easily arrived at. It was only when all else had failed, when all channels of peaceful protest had been barred to us, that the decision was made to embark on violent forms of political struggle and to form Umkhonto we Sizwe. We did so not because we desired such a course, but solely because the government had left us with no other choice. In the manifesto of Umkhonto, published on 16 December 1961, which is Exhibit AD, we said, "The time comes in the life of any nation when there remains only two choices, submit or fight. That time is now come to South Africa. We shall not submit, and we have no choice but to hit back by all means in our power in defense of our people, our future, and our freedom." This was our feeling in June of 1961 when we decided to press for a change in the policy of the National Liberation Movement. I can only say that I felt morally obliged to do what I did. The moral imperative to free his people was stronger than the moral imperative to follow the law. We who had taken this decision started to consult leaders of various organizations, including the ANC. I will not say whom we spoke to or what they said, but I wish to deal with the role of the African National Congress in this phase of the struggle and with the policy and objectives of the Umkhonto we Sizwe. As far as the ANC was concerned, it formed a clear view which can be summarized as follows. It was a mass political organization with a political function to fulfill. Its members had joined on the express policy of nonviolence. Because of all this, it could not and would not undertake violence. This must be stressed. One cannot turn such a body into the small, closely knit organization required for sabotage. Nor would this be politically correct, because it would result in members ceasing to carry out this essential activity, political propaganda and organization. Nor was it permissible to change the whole nature of the organization. On the other hand, in view of the situation I've described, the ANC was prepared to depart from its 50-year policy of nonviolence to this extent, that it would no longer disapprove of properly controlled violence. Hence, members who undertook such activity would not be subject to disciplinary action by the ANC. I say properly controlled violence because I made it clear that if I formed the organization, I would at all times subject it to the political guidance of the ANC and would not undertake any different form of activity from that contemplated without the consent of the ANC. And I shall now tell the court how that form of violence came to be determined. As a result of this decision, Umkhonto was formed in November 1961. When we took this decision and subsequently formulated our plans, the ANC heritage of nonviolence and racial harmony was very much with us. We felt that the country was drifting towards a civil war in which blacks and whites would fight each other. We viewed the situation with alarm. Civil war could mean the destruction of what the ANC stood for. With civil war, racial peace would be more difficult than ever to achieve. We already have examples in South African history of the results of war. It's taken more than 50 years for the scars of the South African War to disappear. How much longer would it take to eradicate the scars of interracial civil war, which could not be fought without a great loss of life on both sides? 4 forms of violence were possible. There's sabotage, there's guerrilla warfare, there's terrorism, and there's open revolution. We chose to adopt the first method and to exhaust it before taking any other decision. In the light of our political background, the choice was a logical one. Sabotage did not involve loss of life, and it offered the best hope for future race relations. Bitterness would be kept to a minimum, and if the policy bore fruit, democratic government could become a reality. This is what we felt at the time, and this is what we said in our manifesto, Exhibit AD. Here's a quote from that document. We of Umkhonto, WCID, have always sought to achieve liberation without bloodshed and civil clash. We hope, even at this late hour, that our first actions will awaken everyone to a realization of the disastrous situation to which the nationalist policy is leading. We hope that we will bring the government and its supporters to their senses before it's too late, so that both the government and its policies can be changed before matters reach the desperate state of civil war. The initial plan was based on a careful analysis of the political and economic situation of our country. We believed that South Africa depended to a large extent on foreign capital and foreign trade. We felt that planned destructions of power plants and interference with rail and telephone communications would tend to scare away capital from the country, making it more difficult for goods from the industrial areas to reach the seaports on schedule, and would in the long run be a heavy drain on the economic life of the country, thus compelling the voters of the country to reconsider their position. In other words, if they're not going to feel it, it's not going to move them. Attacks on the economic lifelines of the country were to be linked with sabotage on government buildings and other symbols of apartheid. These attacks would serve as a source of inspiration to our people. In addition, they would provide an outlet for those people who were urging the adoption of violent methods and would enable us to give concrete proof to our followers that we had adopted a stronger line and were fighting back against government violence. In addition, if mass action were successfully organized and mass reprisals taken, we felt that sympathy for our cause would be roused in other countries and that greater pressure would be brought to bear on the South African government. This then was the plan. Umkhonto was to perform sabotage, and the strict instructions were given to its members right from the start that on no account were they to injure or kill people in planning or carrying out operations. So in the first section, we talked about what the problem is, and we talked about why it is that they finally turned to look at violence as a part of a solution. In the second part, we confirmed that violence is indeed necessary and why, and we talked about what type of violence and the more mildest, the most mild, the type of violence, sabotage that was the closest in line to the policies of nonviolence, and then civil disobedience, and then the very specific plan. And I think this is the last section. Umkhonto was formed by Africans to further their struggle for freedom in their own land. Communists and others supported the movement, and we only wish that more sections of the community would join us. Our fight is against real and not imaginary hardships, or to use the language of the state prosecutor, so-called hardships. Basically, we fight against two features which are the hallmarks of African life in South Africa, and which are entrenched by legislation which we seek to have repealed. These features are poverty and lack of human dignity, and we do not need communists or so-called agitators to teach us about these things. South Africa is the richest country in Africa and could be one of the richest countries in the world, but it's a land of extremes and remarkable contrasts. The whites enjoy what may well be the highest standard of living in the world, whilst Africans live in poverty and misery. 40% of the Africans live in hopelessly overcrowded, and in some cases, drought-stricken reserves, with a capital R, like reservations, you'll note, where soil erosion and the overworking of the soil makes it impossible for them to live properly off the land. 30% are laborers, labor tenants, and squatters on white farms and work and live under conditions similar to those of the serfs of the Middle Ages. The other 30% live in towns where they have developed economic and social habits, which bring them closer in many respects to white standards, yet most Africans, even in this group, are impoverished by low incomes and a high cost of living. The highest paid and the most prosperous section of urban African life is in Johannesburg. Yet their actual position is desperate. The latest figures were given on 25 March 1964 by Mr. Carr, manager of the Johannesburg Non-European Affairs Department. The poverty datum line for the average African family in Johannesburg, according to Mr. Carr's department, is R42.84 per month. I don't know what that means, so I'm going to skip the rest of those kinds of stats here. Poverty goes hand in hand with malnutrition and disease. The incidence of malnutrition and deficiency diseases is very high among Africans. Tuberculosis, pellagra, kwashiorkor, gastroenteritis, and scurvy bring death and destruction of health. The incidence of infant mortality is one of the highest in the world. According to the medical officer of health for Pretoria, tuberculosis kills 40 people a day, almost all Africans. In 1961, there were 58,491 new cases reported. These diseases not only destroy the vital organs of the body, but they result in retarded, sorry about that, because that word is now out of vogue, but he meant it in the way that he meant it in terms of delayed mental conditions and lack of initiative and reduced powers of concentration. The secondary results of such conditions affect the whole community and the standard of work performed by African laborers. The complaint of Africans, however, is not only that they are poor and whites are rich, but that the laws are made by the whites. I'm going to read that again. The complaint of Africans, however, is not only that they are poor and the whites are rich, but that the laws which are made by the whites are designed to preserve this situation. There are two ways to break out of poverty. The first is by formal education, and the second is by the worker acquiring a greater skill at his work and thus higher wages. As far as Africans are concerned, both these avenues of advancement are deliberately curtailed by legislation. The present government has always sought to hamper Africans in their search for education. One of their early acts after coming into power was to stop subsidies for African school feeding. Many African children who attended schools depended on this supplement to their diet. This was a cruel act. There is a compulsory education for all white children at virtually no cost to their parents, be they rich or poor. Similar facilities are not provided for the African children, though there are some who receive such assistance. African children, however, generally have to pay more for their schooling than whites. According to figures quoted by the South African Institute of Race Relations in its 1963 journal, approximately 40% of African children in the age group between 7 to 14 do not attend school. 40%. For those who do attend school, the standards are vastly different from those afforded to white children. In 1960-61, the per capita government spending on African students at state-aided schools was, I can't with the statistics, but it's 12 versus 144. Very nice. The quality of education is also different. According to the Bantu Education Journal, only 5,660 African children in the whole of South Africa passed their junior certificate in 1962, and only 362 passed matriculated probably, so graduated or moved on. This is presumably consistent with the policy of Bantu education, about which the present Prime Minister said during the debate on the Bantu Education Bill in 1953, "When I have control of native education, I will reform it so the natives will be taught from childhood to realize that equality with Europeans is not for them. People who believe in equality are not desirable teachers for natives. When my department controls native education, it will know for what class of higher education a native is fitted and whether he will have a chance in life to use his knowledge." I feel sick. The other main obstacle, back to Mandela, to the economic advancement of the African is the industrial color bar, under which all the better jobs of industry are reserved for whites only. Moreover, Africans who do obtain employment in the unskilled and semi-skilled occupations which are open to them are not allowed to form trade unions which have recognition, denied the right of collective bargaining. The government often answers its critics by saying that Africans in South Africa are economically better off than the inhabitants of other countries in Africa. I don't know whether this statement is true and doubt whether any comparison can be made without having regard to the cost of living index in such countries. But even if it's true, as far as the African people are concerned, it is irrelevant. Our complaint is not that we're poor by comparison with people in other countries, but that we are poor by comparison with the white people in our own country and we're prevented by legislation from altering this imbalance. The lack of human dignity experienced by Africans is the direct result of the policy of white supremacy. White supremacy implies black inferiority. Legislation designed to preserve white supremacy entrenches this notion. Menial tasks in South Africa are invariably performed by Africans. When anything has to be carried or cleaned, the white men will look around for an African to do it for them, whether the African is employed by him or not. Because of this sort of attitude, whites tend to regard Africans as a separate breed. They do not look upon them as people with families of their own. They do not realize that they have emotions, that they fall in love like white people do, that they want to be with their wives and children like white people want to be with theirs, that they want to earn enough money to support their families properly, to feed and clothe them and send them to school. What houseboy or garden boy or laborer can ever hope to do this? I'm reacting to the lack of dignity that he's showing us. He started with that, the lack of human dignity experienced by Africans is the direct result of the policy of white supremacy. And I believe he showed that. Pass laws, which to the Africans are among the most hated bits of legislation in South Africa, render any African liable to police surveillance at any time. I doubt whether there's a single African male in South Africa who's not at some stage had a brush with the police over his pass. Hundreds and thousands of Africans are thrown into jail each year under pass laws. Even worse than this is the fact that pass laws keep husband and wife apart and lead to the breakdown of family life. You'll see our video on incarceration to talk about this. You can directly see what's going on with Palestinians, etc., meaning, etc., the implications. Poverty and the breakdown of family life have secondary effects. Children wander about the streets of the townships because they have no schools to go to, or no money to enable them to go to school, or no parents at home to see that they go to school. Because both parents, if there be two, have to work to keep the family alive. Excuse me. This leads to a breakdown in moral standards, to an alarming rise in illegitimacy, and to growing violence, which erupts not only politically but everywhere. Life in the townships is dangerous. There's not a day that goes by without somebody being stabbed or assaulted, and violence is carried out of the townships in the white living areas. People are afraid to walk alone in the streets after dark. House breakings and robberies are increasing, despite the fact that death sentence can now be imposed for such offenses. Death sentences cannot cure the festering sore. And his conclusion. Africans want to be paid a living wage. Africans want to perform work which they are capable of doing and not work which the government declares them to be capable of. Africans want to be allowed to live where they obtain work and not be endorsed out of an area because they were not born there. Africans want to be allowed to own land in places where they work and not be obliged to live in rented houses which they can never call their own. Africans want to be part of the general population and not confined to living in their own ghettos. African men want to have their wives and children to live with them where they work and not be forced into an unnatural existence in men's hostels. African women want to be with their menfolk and not be left permanently widowed in the reserves. Africans want to be allowed out after 11 o'clock at night, not to be confined to their rooms like little children. Africans want to be allowed to travel in their own country and to seek work where they want to and not where the Labor Bureau tells them to. Africans want a just share in the whole of Africa, in the whole of South Africa. They want security and a stake in society. Above all, we want equal political rights because without them, our disabilities will be permanent. I know this sounds revolutionary to the whites in this country because the majority of voters will be Africans. This makes the white man fear democracy. But this fear cannot be allowed to stand in the way of the only solution which will guarantee racial harmony and freedom for all. It is not true that the enfranchisement of all will result in racial domination, political division based on color. Political division based on color is entirely artificial, and when it disappears, so will the domination of one color group by another. The ANC has spent half a century fighting against racialism. When it triumphs, it will not change that policy. This, then, is what the ANC is fighting. Their struggle is a truly national one. It's a struggle of the African people, inspired by their own suffering and their own experience. It is a struggle for the right to live. During my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to this struggle of the African people. I've fought against white domination, and I've fought against black domination, and I've cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.